Hey, Eddie, how are you doing?
I am very well, thank you very much. And you, sir?
Oh, I'm not too bad, not too bad at all. I'm basking in the glory of my new Sensible Tech virtual background, which I think you'll agree is very professional and very nice.
It is very professional. And just before we started, I was talking enviously about how you've got a white background and therefore you can't see the bit around your heads because you and I both have these things on. It doesn't work with the LOTI background. We're just too colourful. So
That is a shame, but I'm
good design.
happy for Lottie to take inspiration from this particular design classic. So you mentioned then, Lottie, what is it that you do?
So I look after an organisation called the London Office of Technology and Innovation, mercifully LOTI for short, which essentially is there to help London boroughs collaborate on digital and data innovation projects to improve public services and outcomes for Londoners. So we sort of joke that we're professional cat herders, but it's trying to build that network, buildings of knowledge, capacity, running projects, influencing change in the wider sector on behalf of all of our members.
Fab. That is a great sort of summary of that. I mean, there's loads and loads of great projects, obviously, that Lottie is working on, which we could spend all day talking about, I'm sure. But the thing I wanted to talk to you about today was about operating models, new digital age operating models for local public services, because, you and I think, are both big fans of the Tom Loosemore definition of what digital is, which, of course, mentions culture and processes and technology, but also business models, or, we might term it in public service operating models. And that's often, I think, the bit that, whilst everyone acknowledges that that's the bit that's potentially the most transformative part of sort of digital activity, it's also the one that not many people talk about. And that's because it's quite hard. And, that there's not a huge number, I don't think, of sort of examples we can go to, or easy things that we can talk about. Because there's often that sort of fairly trite thing where people will say, well, what's the Airbnb of social care, or what's the Uber of planning control, or whatever it might be. So that's not particularly helpful way of framing it. But one of the few things that have been written on this subject, which are really good, which I point to, and it was indeed the first thing that I saved in the Sensible Tech linked library, you'll be delighted to know. So yeah,
My proudest moment.
a great honor for you, is a piece you wrote when you were working for Nesta a few years ago, where you picked out 6 new sort of operating model styles sort of for local public services. So what I thought it'd be really helpful and really interesting for me, even if it's not for anyone else, would just be to chat through those 6 new operating models and what some examples of them are, and maybe how councils can get started with this kind of thinking. But before we get into the sort of the guts of the detail on that stuff, what are your thoughts generally on that challenge of big picture thinking around digital age operating models in local public service?
It's really, really tough, I think, being really candid about it. And I think to your point around the Tom Loosemore definition, what we've seen over the last decade or so is like exponential levels of innovation in the technology and the data methods that are available to governments. We've seen a tiny fraction of that level of innovation, as you've said, on the operating models itself. So it's really just, can we rebalance that part of the equation so that we're being much more imaginative? And the way I always think about this is, we've just got to recognize the fairly dire state that local public services start in. Financially, 10 years of austerity, Brexit, COVID mean that everyone is trying to do what would have been 5 people's jobs 10 years ago. We've had the rising demand, particularly from COVID, so the scale of need has gone through the roof. And we also notice, I think, even if there weren't those financial constraints, the outcomes that we're getting from our current style of services are just not where we want to be. If anyone's read Hilary Cottam's book, Radical Help, I think one of the most profound chapters or examples that she gives, to sort of paraphrase her crudely, is talking to different teams in adult and children's social care. And like many local authorities, you can sort of post-it note all the different interventions families have had, and it will go for walls and walls and walls. And she poses the question, so which families have come out the other end of this and now are sort of back on their feet and living, fulfilling independent lives? And often met with silence. And that's anecdotal, but trying to recognize our current model of public service delivery may not be financially sustainable or delivering the outcomes we want. And so we want surely all the options that we could possibly have available to us to respond to these ridiculous challenges, these ridiculous needs. And yet we're often looking at public services that are very traditional still. They're very top down. You've got a public service professional either doing the thing or commissioning the thing, a service done to a resident. And as long as we keep doing that, there's a real risk that people like you and me are just sticking digital sticking plasters onto sort of fundamentally broken models. And none of us, I think, really want to be doing that. And we know why it happens. It's because of the silos, it's organizational constraints, it's team design, it's lack of headspace to think more creatively. But the reason I think it's important to talk about new operating models isn't, and we'll come onto this with some specific examples, I'm not saying local authorities should just adopt this model. It's a copy and paste or copy and adapt. It is as useful just to free up our minds to go, wow, I'd never even thought we could think about addressing that problem in that way. And I've often felt my job, and I think LOTI's job, is helping organizations think about their problems in different ways and to realize there's more doors open to them than perhaps they originally thought. And even if it does nothing but that, I think that's still useful. So flipping hard, but we need to think more creatively.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I guess the other thing that's really important here, because that there have been some of the some sort of big consultancies and things out there sort of selling new operating models to councils. But the way that often works is that there's one operating model which then is applied to all of the services that you deliver, whether it's sort of like waste services or social care or something like that, which I must admit has always sort of seemed to me to be absolutely potty. And I think that there needs to be an acknowledgement, I think, isn't there, that local councils in particular are in fact multiple organisations in one, and choosing one way of delivering services across all of those things is just, well, A, impossible, and B, not good anyway.
Exactly. And I think yet starting with a rigid model is not ideal at all for all the reasons you mentioned. And this is why when I've been trying to sort of conceptualize this or try and unpick it, and when we look at sort of newer models and figure out sort of what is actually going on there, rather than being dogmatic about this is an exciting model, as you said, the Airbnb for social care or whatever sort of crude analogy we could make. If you look at some of the interesting models globally, what they seem to be doing is playing with a different set of parameters or variables than that traditional top-down model of public service delivery. So I think in the blog that you've mentioned, I've sort of drawn it out almost like a mixing desk of different sort of knobs or dials that you can tweak to reform a public service. And in our traditional model of public service delivery, off the top of my head, there's sort of roughly 18 different parameters you can play with, whether it's, the time, money, resources you allocate to a problem, the business model, who's eligible, where you offer it from, and of course, technology and data. But there's a different set of parameters that I think become really interesting, such as like where power lies in a particular sort of system, or is it centralized or decentralized? What's the funding model? And perhaps the most important one, what is the role that the public sector organization plays? So what else could it do other than doing the thing or commissioning the thing? Could we incentivize the thing? So I know the GLA, Essex County Council, do things like challenge prizes to say, hello world, we don't know the answer to this big thorny problem, but we'll reward and wrap a process around those with great ideas. Or we've seen during the COVID experience, a lot of local authorities saying the most effective thing we could do is to convene the right people, or to matchmake. Here's someone in need, here's someone who can provide for that need. Our job is to be like government as dating agency. Or there's the TfL model of saying, actually let's release all of our data in a really, really helpful, usable way, and let other people build products and services on top of that, save us money and innovate faster than we can. So I think if we play around with those additional dials, there's more possibilities open to us.
Brilliant. Yeah, and that's a super introduction, I think, into getting into some of the detail around some of those sort of 6 models that you identified in that post. The first of which you entitled Radical Restructuring. Do you want to just give a quick précis of what that means?
So radical restructuring, which I think has the elements of decentralizing and pushing power right down to the front line. A well-known example now, but I think a really powerful one, is the Buurtzorg system of community nursing that originated in the Netherlands. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with that example, essentially what they did was, instead of our sort of model in the UK of timetabling social workers to, you can spend 10 minutes with this vulnerable person. And we've heard the news stories where they're saying, I'm forced to either make them a cup of tea, offer them a shower, or do one thing, but then I've got to dash to the next person. Instead, with this Buurtzorg model, you have self-managing teams of up to about 12 people. They've got their own geographic patch. They are entirely autonomous to decide what they do, for whom, how they do it, how long they spend with a person. So, for example, if they find, one vulnerable old lady who has a whole range of different issues, they could spend 3 hours with her, go and knock on the neighbor's door. They can do a whole range of different things, like the preventative stuff, the human stuff that actually addresses some of those underlying causes of the sort of the problems. And what you notice with that model is staff morale goes through the roof because they're actually doing the thing that they went into that vocation to do. They are treating people as carers, and having that human connection. They're seeing progress because they're solving the problems. So the results are going through the roof. And the amazing thing about that radically decentralized model is that they've got, dozens and dozens of frontline teams with a back office of about 70, or at least when I was writing that article. It will have grown since then, of course, but the difference between the back office for that compared to the UK model and many other countries' model is radically reduced, so radically more cost effective. And so that is enabled by a bit of technology. They've got their own sort of social network, which allows them to troubleshoot, ask questions of each other, and to coordinate their time. But by empowering the front line, shifting the power, decentralizing the model, and by having a different relationship between the people in the system, you can get radically better results. Hard to replicate exactly in the UK, but there's elements there that I think are really quite profound that we could think about some more.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a great one to start with, I think, because, we're talking in the context of digital and digital transformation and stuff. But actually, like you say, there's a bit of underlying tech there, which is, the social networking element. But frankly, this thing would work without that perfectly well, wouldn't it? I suspect that this isn't about deploying a new bit of technology to make this happen. This is just about rethinking the way that we deliver a service, which irrespective of the gubbins that goes behind that.
Exactly. And again, so maybe this is the one other thing to point out about that Tom Loosemore definition of digital. If I recall correctly, technology comes last on the list. And that's for a good reason. It's like technology and data, they are enablers. You don't start with them. They're the thing that enables the thing you want to do. So start with the thing you're trying to make happen. And often, all the technology in the world will not make up for a bad process. So start with your process.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, and it's a great place to start on that one. So that's fantastic. So that's about radical restructuring. The second one is a slightly wordier one, which is augmenting capacity of the public service with volunteers. So talk us through that one.
I need a pithier title for that one. So to bring it alive, let's talk about a specific example. So the original version of the Good Sam app that's become more well known as a result of COVID, but the original version was when I dial 999 to report that someone's had a heart attack, cardiac arrest or similar, clearly the 999 call center will dispatch an ambulance, but they are also able to send out an alert via the Good Sam app, which has got lots of volunteer trained first aiders, and it will ping the nearest first aider to wherever the victim is, giving them a map of where the victim is, and also a map of the nearest defibrillator. And if they can get there first, before the ambulance can get there, they might well save a life. And they have saved lives. It's not hypothetical. They've got the case studies now to show it. What is interesting about this, the key point I'd make is this is not an app that digitized calling 999. It's an app that has fundamentally increased the capacity of a public service to respond to need by using tech to tap into a volunteer network. And so again, it's we don't copy and paste that into every other sector, but thinking as a result of COVID, we're seeing a massive rise in enthusiasm for volunteering. Lots of people now want to be really active in their communities. How can we intelligently integrate that with public service delivery models? And this is where digital can do it at scale and make it much, much easier than it would have been in the past. How can we increase that capacity? Given my first point was we simply do not have the resources in local government or the wider public sector to respond to every need in the way that we'd want. So that's why I like that model.
Yeah, it's a great one, isn't it? And you can sort of think it through as well. I mean, I don't know myself about the specifics of how Good Sam sort of handles this stuff, but obviously, you know, whenever you think about volunteers working on behalf or, you know, alongside public services, there's always issues like safeguarding and things like that people immediately sort of start flagging as, quite rightly, as risks in this area. And of course, overcoming a lot of that stuff, you know, the various checks and things one needs to do can be an awfully bureaucratic process. But again, maybe it's some of that kind of stuff is where, you know, you can open a bank account with Monzo, can't you now, without speaking to a human being or touching a pen or a piece of paper. So there probably are ways that, you know, all that stuff could be handled through digital processes to make that side of things much easier, which then enables the human beings to actually get on with their side of the bargain.
Indeed, and I think there's clearly different models might lend themselves to sort of different contexts of risk. So I think in the case of somebody could save a life and it's for the sake of getting there a few minutes earlier, what are the downsides? I mean, there's limited downsides in that scenario. I appreciate this is where I think we've got to be really thoughtful, and we're not saying dogmatically just apply this model, it'll work for anywhere. As you said, you know, the one model does not fit all with very good reason. But there may well be solutions. Maybe we can overcome some of those things that would have been barriers a few years ago that we now plainly see are no longer barriers thanks to internet era business models.
Fantastic. Great stuff. So we've done sort of restructuring teams so that we're empowering the front line a lot more. We've looked at models that sort of energize a volunteer group to help us delivering services. Now move on to the third one, which is, I think, to use one of those analogies, I think is Tinder for local government. So how does this work, Eddie?
I mentioned, government as dating agency, government as matchmaker. And the idea here is that rather than government saying, we've got a public service professional and we're just going to, you know, you will have some of their time as a resident and they will come and solve your problem, or we've outsourced a service, is to say our job is to help find people in need and connect them with those who can respond to that need. So an obvious area would be people who need things like home care, which we know is hugely expensive, very difficult to get those resources from public service professionals. And so one internet era business model we know works incredibly well is a matchmaking platform. And so there's a number of examples and there's sort of subtle variations, but in the care world, there's organizations like the Equal Care Co-op and Trust on Tap, both of whom were supported by my previous organization, Nesta, which essentially say, here's a person with a certain set of needs, they can describe those needs, and they can be connected intelligently with people who are actually local and able to respond to those needs. So we've got sort of government playing a different role. That's an interesting variable that's changed. The other one, I think, is some of the organization types that you could wrap around that. So one of the weird paradoxes we seem to have in the area of social care is that it's ridiculously expensive, and yet the carers themselves seem to be on minimum wage or getting sort of, you know, appalling levels of remuneration and reward given how critical their role is. So there's examples of where cooperatives are being formed. So actually more money is being kept in that sort of care system. We've removed some of that middle management cost. We've removed some of that, what can feel quite inhumane, sort of rigid timetabling of you can have 10 minutes here, 10 minutes there, having those Buurtzorg style effects of like better care as a result. But again, government stepping back and saying our job is to connect, it isn't to do. They can design and host that service potentially, or a lot of these models, actually, the interesting thing is they're starting in the third sector or the private sector and just going, don't get in the way. Like, see, how could you work with, support, endorse, signpost, that sort of resource? And even if all you're doing is effectively signposting, you may well then reduce pressure on core public services. So that's why I like those models.
Yeah, exactly. I must admit, I'm a big fan of this one in particular. And I think what's quite interesting is we've seen a fair bit of work in the last sort of 5 years or so in a variety of councils. And I think there's been some central government funding for some projects in this space. Yeah. And it tends to focus on this idea of the community service directory seems to be the thing, which is, you know, a very technocentric way of sort of talking about this stuff. But nonetheless, you know, I can remember when I was working with Croydon, we had a bit of a look at this. We actually discovered that there were 13 different directories of services using a fairly broad definition of what that is. I think one of them was a Word document that you could download from a website somewhere, but nonetheless, like a database of like local services, whether in the third sector, community groups, or what have you. And there's been some great work. I think that Ben Unsworth and Paul Brewer were working together on setting like a data standard around community directories, so that the data could be ported and moved around a lot easier, which is great. And now we're starting to see some sort of alpha digital products coming out, which are a bit more usable and user-centered sort of directories on the tech side. But what's interesting to me, and I'm slowly getting to the point here, is that they are only looking at one side of the bargain here, which is, if we're matchmaking, all we've got here is knowledge about the people that can meet a need. What we don't know anything about at all is the people who have the need in the first place. So for it to be to sort of make the most of those new directories and that data that's being collected, you also need the demand side in there somewhere. So you actually need a way for people to say, I need a room in a village hall to run my daughter's birthday party, or I need someone to come and look after my mum when I'm not around, or to come and have a chat with her because she's lonely and I can't always get there myself. Or even, I need to borrow a chainsaw. I don't want to buy one. I just need it for an hour. As anybody, and it's that kind of bit that's missing, isn't it? That for this to be a matchmaking thing, it's got to come from both sides. And all the effort at the moment seems to be on, here's all the stuff, but actually we've got no idea what the user needs are of the people that might need that stuff.
Yeah, I think you've identified a real problem there, and I guess there's a number of different solutions. So one is, some of these matchmaking platforms do lend themselves to very, very bespoke communities. So in the care example, maybe it's absolutely fine to have, there's a dedicated or multiple different care platforms where people can describe their needs. Or you can literally go for corporate services. So one example I saw, I'm forgetting the town, much to my embarrassment, but on YouTube, there's a TEDx talk there's a Canadian city that was looking at saying, our bus service is just not fit for purpose and it's unaffordable, and it doesn't seem to be getting the right people to where they need to be. And so they've basically taken their entire bus budget and instead just subsidize Uber trips. And so you've got people declaring, obviously using the traditional Uber app, but in that one town, they get, heavy subsidy, and it gets people from A to B, and at basically the same cost they were spending on buses, but they're getting more people around. And maybe that's geographically specific based on the style and size of that town. But so those dedicated platforms can work. The other bit, though, to your wider point around how do we get data on the demand side, I think another lesson of COVID was that we need to get much more robust sort of data sharing relationships between councils and their local VCS, because often this councils receive the demand. They then are sometimes just sending an email to refer, or we've been contacted by, Mrs. Smith, she needs this sort of support, and sending the email out to whichever charity is out there in the community. And so the charities end up being utterly inundated with these cases, and there's no feedback loop to say, we've got the capacity, or we don't have the capacity, or actually tell us more about the specific need, because there might be a different charity that could help. So one project LOTI's been working on with some MHCLG funding with Camden and Central Bedfordshire is, how do you get that data sharing relationship right between VCS and council? But it'd be great if the open referral standard could look more in that, if it hasn't already. That's a really interesting thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea that these sort of poor, community and voluntary groups having to update 13 different directories with all their services or whatever it might be, is just ludicrous.
It just won't happen.
No, exactly. Well, exactly. Yeah, it's not going to happen. Or if it does, that stuff's never going to get updated, is it? So yeah, some way in which all of that stuff can be tied up, I think, is really, really important. Brilliant. Thanks for that one, Eddie. So the next one, number 4, is peer-to-peer support networks.
So this is basically a subtle variation on the previous theme, I think, but instead of saying, here's a professional being connected with someone in need, I think we've seen a rise of a lot of this, more of the sort of the sharing economy style. Can a neighbor help another neighbor? And whether it's, there are some about sharing a room, and so there is sort of the Airbnb for people who've recently been discharged from hospital. but who live alone and therefore can't live alone because they need some care. And so can you find people in the community, maybe hopefully in the same village or town, who could say, well, we can give you our spare room, we can check you've got your medicine, we can help you get up and get out the house for that transition period. Another famous example, which I know has had mixed results. Some people have found it very successful, other communities less so, was Casserole Club, which I believe was developed by FutureGov, where people sort of share, if they've got spare meals that they want to be able to share. And again, there's an interesting innovation on the idea of meals on wheels provided by, a central organization. So there's a lot of complexity in getting the supply and demand right. Just as you mentioned earlier with the Good Sam example, there's maybe some risks we've got to worry about. Whenever we get into the area of statutory services or very vulnerable people, it's kind of not acceptable if someone doesn't turn up with a meal or someone doesn't turn up to do the care. And so these volunteering style models, I think we've got to take with a lot of caution. But again, I'm sure with a bit of creative thought, we could identify areas of sort of community life where local authorities working with VCS to think what kinds of way can we more intelligently marshal volunteers at a very local level, building more resilience in those communities, building the relationships in those communities, as Hilary Cotton would argue, is absolutely vital. Just feels like something we should be exploring more.
Absolutely, and I suppose there's a big cultural shift here, isn't there, for the public service to get their heads around, which is that this is not getting people to do the work of a professional in the way that professional would have done it previously for free, is it? Because that's, just, well, never going to happen, but also, probably not what is required as well in that circumstance. So, that there's the professionalization of these public services over the years, has resulted in, I guess, a build-up, say, of like management overhead and a bit of bureaucracy and process and all that kind of thing, which is important. But nonetheless, if you're switching to a model which some parts of that are delivered by volunteers, it's got to be thought about in a different way, because it just isn't going to fit otherwise, is it?
It's not. And I think, there's lots of things to pick there, but it's almost where we end up with a policy question. So where we have areas of statutory responsibility for local authorities, some of those laws say that the local authority must do the thing. They're quite prescriptive for, like, you literally need to provide this exact service. What I think is better and what would give us more room for innovation is where the law says the local authority is on the hook for guaranteeing this outcome. And that way we can think much more creatively around professional services need to be there to assure that the outcome is delivered, but we've got far more sort of wiggle room and creativity space on the means to get there, where volunteers might be one component part, but they're working alongside trained professionals who can provide the assurance or accreditation or whatever else is the expert support that might be needed. So again, requires a lot of unpicking, but when we're doing our sort of user design and we're doing the prototyping stage, what I really want is everyone going, oh, well, let's at least explore that option. Is there any mileage there or not? And there may well be.
Totally. And this is another great example, I think, of one of those operating models where the technology is entirely incidental, isn't it?
Completely.
For this one. Yeah, absolutely.
Most
it's
definitely.
all about, as you say, policy decisions and service design. So we're moving into the last two that we've got here, and they're both sort of related, I think, in a way, because they're led sort of technology-led innovation, I think, with some of these. So the first one is the digital social innovation idea. What was that? That sounds like it might include quite a lot of stuff, Eddie, but what was your thinking here?
A lot of stuff. So digital social innovation is basically the European Commission slightly highfalutin term for tech for good. And in a lot of my conversations with local authorities, I think we love to moan about the big suppliers. We talk a lot about wanting to work with more innovative companies, and particularly SMEs and startups. The bit that often feels absent from the conversation are social sector organizations who actually have some really creative models, often that are digitally enabled. So it's like social innovation models, but enabled by tech. And Nesta, and we can maybe include the link in the description to this video, have got a whole database of dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of charities with really innovative models in the care space, whether it's sort of open source voice activated assistants that can help in areas like work in the area of assistive technology and sort of home care, to digital democracy tools. And again, one innovation or one trend we've seen from the COVID crisis is UK councils for the first time putting more of their democratic conversations and discussions online and actually quite liking the results, with some famous negative examples that went viral. But by and large going, wow, we can engage with people in a different way. And there's this incredible sector that is mostly hidden to local government, that's got these incredible innovations, but we should be trying to engage with them just as we're trying to do early market engagement with more innovative suppliers. So that's probably the most nebulous of all of them. But I see huge untapped potential if we could get that relationship right.
Yeah, absolutely. And so linked to that is the sixth one, which is around specifically about data and opening data up.
Exactly. So the example I give there is the TfL model. So for anyone who's not familiar with this, TfL have got something called their unified API, which is a real-time API that gives basically live data on the location of all their different modes of transport and other important bits of information that enable you to make sense of that. And a good few years ago now, this was back in my think tank days, so probably talking 9-10 years ago, TfL, I think, made a really smart decision that instead of going out and building a whole suite of apps, they instead said, well, if we release the data, let's see what other people can build. And on top of it, last time I checked, there was at least 600 transport apps, of which Citymapper being the most famous, had been built using that data. And the wonderful thing there is TfL saved a chunk of cash from not having to build those digital services. They had incredible levels of innovation, apps, down to some very specific levels of, or for very specific communities. So some people who want like really granular information on which lifts are working now, like vital for accessibility, might not have occurred to a big public sector organization. Hopefully these days it would, but perhaps then it wouldn't have done. So we've got this whole proliferation of useful applications. And I think there again, so government playing a different role. We're not doing the thing. We're not going, let's build the app. We're saying, well, how about we release our data and see what people can do with it? And one of my previous critiques of local government approach to open data has been, let's take lots of our valuable data and just publish it and hope for the best. And the TfL model shows, no, you're not just publishing and hoping for the best. You provide the support around it. You really go to town on making sure this data is quality, rigorous. It's got some SLAs around it. If I'm going to invest my business in building with this data, I want to know it's going to be there a year from now. And I can guarantee it's going to be provided to a high standard and a consistent quality. And so it's shifting council's attention to going, our areas of expertise might need to be subtly different, but if we do it, we could open up a whole new world of innovation, which we talk about, but often lack the capacity within local government to do ourselves. So that's, I think, another interesting one to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the challenges that comes to my mind around this one, Eddie, is about scale in a sense. So obviously, TfL, there is a lot of data there. We can probably describe it as being big, that data. Local authorities, of course, vary quite sort of radically in terms of their size and their scale and all that kind of stuff. And I guess the London boroughs that you work with at LOTI, fine, they might not be massive geographically, but in terms of population, they're probably among some of the biggest in the UK.
250,000 each, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess is there a thing here at which point you've got enough data at a usable scale that you can actually do something here, or are there ways to work around that by sort of aggregating data up, perhaps from other sources, other councils, and that kind of thing? What's your thoughts on that?
You're queuing me up for my other great passion, which is, the thing I've been a broken record about for the last decade, and hence why I do what I do at LOTI, is it is not enough for organizations just to be good with their own data. The real potential comes when we can join up, act upon it at a sort of city or a region-wide scale. And so the concept behind organizations like LOTI, and I'm very pleased to see the rise of lots of offices of data analytics around the UK, is actually the population of, well, one borough probably doesn't have enough data to build some really clever applications. But also, if you're trying to incentivize the business community or volunteers to develop an app, it's not unreasonable. They want to make some money from that. If the only customer base for the app can be the population of one local authority area, that's not big enough to be a viable business model for them. So I say to London boroughs, don't release your data just individually. If we can join it up and developers can say, well, we've potentially got a target market of 8 million people now. suddenly the level of innovation and interest you're going to get is going to be much, much higher. So to London boroughs, we are really strongly encouraging them to say, share whatever data you can, particularly non-personal data that can be open, share it via the London data store. And if we can get commonality across that, preferably in common standards, but we can work with complexity, you're likely to get greater levels of innovation if we do it that way. Similar with other sort of cities and city regions. Again, if local authorities, other public sector organisations work together, and indeed if they start having big conversations, as we've seen, another silver lining of the COVID crisis, for the first time, really serious conversations about making use of corporate data sets. So in London, lots of boroughs making use of data from the likes of MasterCard, O2, which are inherently city scale and can complement their local insights, and wrap together, you can start to do some clever stuff, and other developers can do clever stuff. But we've got to get it out there and give the developer community a fighting chance. It's not going to happen by accident.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, that's really good advice. So that's fab. So that's a run through those 6 kind of new operating models that you raised. I mean, the other operating models are available. Of course,
Indeed,
it's not an exhaustive list. And of course, all of these things, you know, you mentioned the other post, and which I'll link to as well, which is all around the more subtle fine tuning of some of this stuff in terms of some of those variables, those dials, as you sort of call them, there. I mean, the challenge here, isn't it, is for councils that, as you say, you know, are a bit cash strapped, generally speaking, don't have a huge amount of capacity for thinking about anything other than just meeting their day-to-day obligations. Have you got any advice for, you know, how do you get started with this kind of thinking? Because you can't break what you're already doing. So it's kind of like operating that sort of brownfield environment, isn't it? What are some tips for how councils can start thinking about really redesigning those operating models from the ground up, and finding out what works and what doesn't, and then scaling up from there? What would be your advice around that?
So a few tips. So one is, after I left Nesta, they started doing all the interesting work on new operating models. So again, maybe a link that we could include is to their work as part of the Upstream Collaborative that did a lot more rigorous research than I ever managed to get through on the range of different models, and really trying to unpick what's going on there. So I think recommended reading, they've got lots of great resources. The second thing is, we talk about it a lot in local government, but I don't always see it practiced. And it's something that LOTI tries to just drive home time and time again, is the need to have an outcomes-based methodology for projects. We still have a tendency to start with going, oh, this is our service, that's the problem with the service, let's fix the service. And the paradigm you're working in is within the context of your existing model.
Yeah.
And if we can pause that and go, that may well be absolutely correct, but let's just re-establish what is the real world outcome we're trying to have here, or the more specific question, which specific people do we want to be better off in which specific ways because we acted? And if you can just have that, it just frees you slightly to go, okay, it may be the right answer is to fix our current process, but are there other routes to get there? So in creating a safe space to have that conversation, we're not saying wait for weeks or months. You could do that in a single workshop, but have the chance to think through that. Probably the final thing I'd say, other than just reading more about this sort of topic, is genuinely, I think it's really difficult for any individual local authority to try this alone. It is too experimental. The cost is high. The learning journey might be slow. Again, and I know you'd expect me to say this, but it's why I do what I do. You need entities like LOTI, or informal collaborations between local authorities to say, how about let's divvy up the experiment? You 3 try this incarnation, you 3 try this one. And that way we're spreading the risk, spreading the cost, and we'll accelerate the learning journey. And would strongly encourage some of the remaining do tanks out there like Nesta and their kin to chuck some money behind this and to really start investing, because the sector needs it. I'd encourage MHCLG to be investing to help it make it more possible. And for any LOTI boroughs, really want to create a safe space where we can help de-risk and learn together, because we don't know the answers. It may not all work, but if now's not the time, then what's plan B? I honestly don't know what plan B is. So we need to start looking hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the other thing maybe to pick up on is something you mentioned right at the beginning, which is that actually it's not always the case that this work actually has to happen within the council itself, particularly those services that are commissioned from,
Yeah.
the charity or community and voluntary sector, or indeed from, private suppliers, that actually perhaps those organizations have got a little bit more room for maneuver in terms of how they deliver their services. And perhaps that's a space in which, some of the innovating can actually happen.
Indeed. And I think, again, the positive trend of seeing much closer collaboration between councils and VCS during the pandemic, let's actually continue those conversations. Let's not go back to our business as usual again. We're out of immediate crisis mode, but to go, are there ways where we can be more systematic in addressing local need? VCS with incredible knowledge and sometimes resources about what local communities need. Local authorities with an abundance of data and obviously, as you said, a bewildering array of different services that they may offer. Can we be more strategic and less ad hoc about how those partnerships work? And yeah, trying to fund, support, work with the third sector and those other social innovators. There's some great stuff out there, but again, in local government, everyone is so busy keeping the lights on. I'm in awe of those who find time to innovate, and we lack the time to read and find out about this world. So again, another thing I hope LOTI and others can do, and think tanks should be doing, let's pray-see the great ideas, let's make it accessible, digestible, and get them to the coalface so we can try them.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. No, fantastic, Eddie. I quite agree with all of that. So that's been absolutely marvelous. Thanks for that sort of quick canter through the world of sort of new operating models. As you say, we managed to cover a whole lot of ground in a relatively short space of time there, which has been absolutely terrific. If people want to track you down and harangue you about any of this stuff, where are they able to do that?
On Twitter, I am Eddie A. Copeland. So feel free to connect with me there. LinkedIn, you'll find if you see this face, that's me. Otherwise, do follow LOTI's work, so loti.london, where that's where I blog these days and where all the resources my team creates and the stuff I write about, you'll find it there.
Fantastic. No, that's absolutely brilliant. And we'll include all the links to all the stuff we've been talking about in the notes and stuff as well, so people can follow up on that. But thank you ever so much for your time, Eddie. That's been super informative and just a little bit edutaining as well.
Very good. Well, very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, cheers then. Bye-bye.